The first lesson from the crisis is that economic growth was inadequate before the crisis, and indeed was a key factor behind the advent of the crisis itself. In developing countries, in particular, the jobs that were created were insufficient in number or did not have sufficient quality. Many young people who, even before the crisis, were leaving school did not find the jobs, the kind of jobs corresponding to their educational attainment and their educational standards, and therefore either were unemployed or found informal jobs or relatively precarious jobs. In general, income inequality had increased significantly before the crisis. Between 1980 and 2005, the share of the top richest 1% income people had increased their share in national income from 7.5% in 1980 to 13.4% of total income, global income, in 2005. So the top 1% got 13% of total income by 2005. The second key lesson from the crisis is that a job-centered approach, taking into account initial conditions, had helped overcome the crisis. So even though growth was imbalanced before the crisis, in fact, by rebalancing growth, we managed to overcome the worst of the crisis, to put a floor on the recession and kickstart the economy. Why is it so? It's very much the spirit of the Global Jobs Pact. It's because, and that's the heart of it, the double benefit from a job-centered approach. Double benefit in terms of supporting incomes of people and therefore helping in terms of social cohesion, so important at the time of the crisis, but also to kickstart the recovery. Because the job-centered approach, the beauty of it is that it facilitates participation in the labor market and indeed avoid long-term unemployment, exclusion from the labor market, too much informality in developing countries, and facilitate, therefore, the recovery. The third lesson is that even though we know that growth was unbalanced before the crisis, and even though we know that to face the crisis will rebalance growth, and that was actually very helpful, now it turns out that as the economy starts, and is very uneven, of course, across countries, the job-centered agenda is being questioned. And it's a very important concern, of course. It's been questioned in the sense that the institutionalization of those policy responses, which in some cases were emergency programs, it's difficult to institutionalize them, and we need to move ahead with this. And sometimes the argument is that, okay, let's now focus on growth, the rest will follow, but we know it didn't before the crisis. So it's important that, okay, we move with growth, but with an equity and strong labor market institution approach, so that we also move with quality jobs as we move with growth.
The ILO was quite well on the alert before the full force of the crisis hit in late 2008. We had consistently expressed concern about the unbalanced character of the globalization process, which we saw as not creating enough decent work, points that Raymond was making, not bringing down poverty fast enough, especially in a world where there's a growing labor force, particularly in the developing world. And thus was leading to an exacerbation of social and economic inequality, both within countries and to a certain extent between nations. So this concern culminated in the adoption in 2008 of our Declaration on Social Justice for a Fair Globalization, which turned out to be an extremely prescient document. So early in 2008, with the first signs of the crisis beginning to show, the office and the governing body and indeed the Labour Conference in the summer of 2008 was really starting to think, well, what if? What if this crisis comes? What's going to be the impact on jobs? What can we do about it in terms of employment and social protection policies? Secondly, immediately after the Lehman Brothers collapsed, the governing body had a full discussion of what the ILO, and more importantly, its constituents, should do. This was in November 2008. some of you will recall that led to a statement by the officers, six measures that to address the impact of the crisis, which, to cut things short, led to a whole series of discussions which culminated in the adoption of the Global Jobs Pact in the summer of 2009 by the International Labour Conference. And here I'd like to stress something that was rather special of that adoption. It was launched with the attendance of 11 heads of state and 5 vice presidents at a special summit on the global jobs crisis. That had a huge impact at the time. The ILO's decent work agenda had already been endorsed by a very strong resolution in the summer of 2008 by the ECOSOC. And this had started to build up a considerable effort to mainstream into the UN development effort agenda poverty eradication through the creation of decent work. The 2010 Millennium Development Goals Summit, the General Assembly, stressed the importance of the decent work agenda, and interestingly, I think that for the first time, the importance of the role of trade unions and employers in pursuing that agenda. At the operational level, throughout this period, these high-level political endorsements have been really helpful in helping to connect our decent work country programs, the ILO's country programming tool, to the overall United Nations Development Assistance Framework, so that in countries we're able to pursue a coherent approach. And again, that's been tremendously important as these national policy efforts have adapted to the crisis and the need to accelerate recovery. In September 2010, of the Oslo conference, the IMF and the ILO, at the invitation of Prime Minister Stoltenberg, had a joint conference on the challenges of growth and employment and social cohesion. Again, if I just reinforce my point about the role of leaders, Prime Ministers of Spain and Greece, as well as the Prime Minister of Norway, the President of Liberia, and several Ministers of Finance and Labour addressed that conference and joined in the work. I think it sent out a clear message that resolving the financial and jobs crises and generating sustainable growth path in the future required integrated policy action. A very powerful message from 2 organizations that a lot of people were surprised to see having a joint conference.
I'm really delighted that we in the Club de Madrid are cooperating with the ILO to organize this event, and I'm honored to be able to speak at this session today. This session represents a confluence of interest and concerns of the ILO expressed in the Director General's report on a new era of social justice and the Club de Madrid through its Shared Societies project. First, perhaps I need to say a few words about ourselves, not too long, as I'm here today not just as former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, but as member and current president of the Club de Madrid, and the club has been actively involved in these issues for a number of years. The Club de Madrid is, as you may know, the largest network in the world of democratic former heads of state and heads of government, with now 81 members from 57 different countries. It is dedicated to strengthening democratic values and leadership around the world by drawing on the experience and resources of its members. We make our time available for free, and we are available for identifying current challenges that the world is experiencing, where it feels that its members can make a contribution. But today I want to share with you on our engagement with the issue of overcoming social division and how this also relates to a people-centered ILO's approach. I congratulated earlier today Director General Somavia for his excellent report and for his statements, and as he said in that report, it's time to, I quote, it's time to reconceive adjustment policies as policies that adjust to people's needs. Leaders nowadays should feel the heat much more than they did perhaps in the past in their back. They should know and can know that what happened elsewhere in the world can easily also be repeated at home. And the positive reason is that social inclusion social cohesion, a good balance between economic growth, which is never a goal in itself, and well-being of citizens, and a high job and security level pays off.
When you look in history, not too long ago, capital was perceived to be the enemy of labor, and governments behaved as if they could overtax capital to succeed, and at the same time muzzle or limit labor from insisting on fair share of returns from investment. Into the current times, I believe the whole world is accepting that unless all these factors come together to hold together, the world might sink together till the leadership of the tripartite partnership agreed to work together. This is what is happening. And no country is an island now. Since 2008, with the financial crisis in the United States, we saw how quickly every other nation around the globe came into problems. Trade was disjointed. Stability became a rare commodity everywhere and anywhere. Until recently, China was a very protected economy. But now, even China, is it continuing to be protected? We read that there's vast movement from rural parts into the urban areas. And as the middle class begins to show, there's more expectation from governments. Sooner or later, people will demand better housing, more employment, quality employment, fair pay, so forth and so on. So China, I believe, is on the same trajectory as the erstwhile developed countries. Africa, and I'm happy we see so many of our people here, we are still struggling. We're described as developing. I subscribe to the Club de Madrid's vision of democracy that delivers, even for Africa. Anybody telling us that we could have shortcuts to growth and development without democratization, especially in this day of ICT, where there's no secrecy, and we know the prevalence of ICT on the continent of Africa now. 10 years ago, the prevalence rate of people in Ghana having mobile phones didn't measure to more than 400,000. As I speak with you, I believe it's over 15 million people. And they know the Twitter, they know the Google, the Facebook, everything. So whatever was happening in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, we see it by the day. And we have universities and higher educational institutions sprouting all over the place. So this youth, they see. They now tell you first degrees do not guarantee them jobs. Even master's degrees do not get them the quality job they want. This is exactly what has happened in Tunisia and is there in sub-Saharan Africa. So the challenge is on us. What I believe should be the situation is what the ILO is advocating. Let all the partners in the tripartism know the sources of the problems. Let us all be advocates. Let our constituents get to know with us why we have problems. We are being overtaken by globalization. Our population is exploding. Africa is not industrialized yet, but our boys and girls, they want to share in the expectations of the developed world. If they can't get it at home, they become idle hands, and they say the devil would give them jobs. And we know what that would mean. Revolutions, but if they are going to explode without direction, then I tell you, we can't have hope for globalization, even though we can't escape from globalization either. And this is why I believe the developed world, the emerging world, the developing world, all of us should hold together. Let the international multilateral institutions like ILO, like the United Nations itself, IMF, World Health Organization, let them all accept to advocate for a global vision.
Sin la creación de empleos, no es posible mejorar en el largo plazo las condiciones de vida de la población y elevar su bienestar. Quisiera señalar algunas razones para sustentar esta primera afirmación. ¿Por qué los latinoamericanos, los africanos, los árabes, dejan sus países? Corren toda suerte de penalidades y emigran a los Estados Unidos y Europa. Porque no tienen empleo en sus países y porque tienen la esperanza de conseguirlos en el mundo desarrollado. Y cuando obtienen ese empleo, cambia sus vidas. Pueden educar a sus hijos, mejorar su salud, jubilarse, elevarse socialmente y económicamente. Creo que en África, en Asia, en América Latina tenemos la obligación de hacer lo que han hecho en el mundo desarrollado. Organizar economías que creen empleos suficientes para dar un puesto de trabajo a todo joven o a todo adulto que lo solicita.
Among all UN institutions, ILO is the most interactive democratic institution. It is interactive with all segments of the society. It's not just a preaching institution, it's a practicing institution. So this is a great pleasure for me to be here. I come from Yemen. The youth revolution now is in the first week of its 5th month. And thousands of people are living in the squares, in tents, have created their own culture. I think this is the longest Arab Spring so far. I don't know if another country can beat us. But it shows the complexity of the situation in the Middle East. Tunisia lasted, I think, 14 days or so, and the change came. Egypt, a little bit longer, and the change came. After the first month of the youth revolution in Yemen, the change was announced by the president himself, who was being asked to leave. He said, we need a new constitution and we need a new political system. The new political system is parliamentarian system where the president is not an executive president. I felt that at that moment the youth have fulfilled a great achievement. Yet now they are still there in their 5th month. I will not go into many details, but last April I was asked by Club de Madrid to send a short intervention in a brainstorming session called the Arab Spring in Madrid. I was not able to leave the country, so I sent my intervention and I said, what we are witnessing in the Arab world is the outcome of a root cause of this spring, namely 3 M's: misrule, mismanagement and mistreatment. I believe that the Middle East is changing. However, I must say we have not delivered. In Tunisia, I am rather optimistic that that change will deliver. Egypt, I am not sure. Yemen, I am pessimistic. Now, the theme is social justice, development with social justice. I believe that social justice starts with democracy and the rule of law, two factors that are in many developing countries, with minor exceptions, not there. Unless we have a democratic process that is totally inclusive, and democracy that delivers, it's not just you deliver your vote into the ballot box. Democracy that delivers, it delivers inclusion, equality, and justice. Otherwise, there is no meaning to democracy at all. This is an uphill struggle. I do not think that removing a leader is enough or is going to produce immediate results. Unfortunately, in the Middle East, many leaders struck democracy out with the stroke of a pen. Now we have to go back to democracy with the crawl of a snail. That is really the problem of the Middle East. Thank you.
The position of ILO on social justice, as we have heard from Winkok, our president of Club de Madrid, is very similar and is in accord with our own position on shared society. But there are certain pertinent questions that we should ask ourselves. Can we really have social justice with 50% of citizens of a country being unemployed or being underemployed? Can you really have social justice in a situation where democracy, rule of law, and popular participation are absent? Obviously, the answer will be no. But when the meltdown started, as the ILO was doing its own work, the leaders of the Western world and the G20 were also doing their own to stem the tide. And this tide had been substantially stemmed, but there's still fragility of recovery. I am worried. I am apprehensive about unemployment in our continent. And it's not been taken as seriously as it should be. I give example of my own country, Nigeria. We now have 120 universities. When I was growing up and I had to go to university, there was only one university in Nigeria. And I'm still a very young man. Today, 120. There are other tertiary institutions, polytechnics, colleges of education. When you take all of them together, there are more than 200, much more than 200. If you allow them to, or you grant them that they are graduating about 3,000 graduates every year, and some are doing more than that. Huh? By one tertiary institution, 3,000. You have well over 600,000. We are not creating 100,000 jobs every year for graduates of our tertiary institutions. That is a tinderbox on which we are all sitting. And the fuse can be ignited anytime.